morning, everyone. Thank you very much for following us online today. And today we have pleasure to invite Professor Mauro Guillen from the Wharton School. And he is also the author of 2030 and is published in many languages. So this is very wonderful and a very insightful and informative book that recommended by the Wall Street News as well, and also published in many languages, both in traditional Chinese and also coming the simplified Chinese in very soon, and also in many languages as well. So I think today it is really our pleasure to invite Professor Guillen to talk about the 2030, given as we know that in 2020 we are experiencing the world and it's changing, transforming, and the paradigm is being redesigned. So I think this is very interesting book to give us a very comprehensive landscape and to see what's going on and what is happening and what we should take into consideration for embracing the future. So Professor Guillen, thank you very much for joining us today. I know now is the late evening in the United States, so really appreciate for your time. So if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Chen, for inviting me to join you today. It is 9 p.m. here in the United States, but I normally watch TV until very late in the evening. So this is perfectly fine. I am delighted to be here. It's truly an honor to be able to address all of you here today, all of the faculty and students from the Business School, International Business School, and Zhejiang University. I have traveled to China many times, and it is a country that I greatly enjoy. And of course, I always try to learn as much as I can about it. As Professor Chen mentioned, what I'm going to do is perhaps use the next 25 minutes or so to tell you about the main messages in this book, but especially the messages that relate to the future of consumer markets and also financial markets. I'm going to emphasize that, given that you're all affiliated with an international business school. I am going to be sharing the PowerPoints here. And of course, Professor Chen, I'll be very happy if you remind me later to send you the PowerPoints, and you can also share them with participants. And I understand that after 25 minutes or so of presentation, then I will be taking questions from the audience that you're going to be gathering. So let me begin sharing, and let me know if this procedure here doesn't go as expected. So here I am sharing the PowerPoints for the presentation. I would like to tell you a little bit about what's inside of this book. And perhaps the best way to take a look at it is by looking at the table of contents, meaning the different chapters in the book. Let me first tell you that I started to do research for this book about 7 years ago. I was making many presentations to my MBA students, to my undergraduate students, and also executive education participants in some of the programs that we have at Wharton. And some of those groups, by the way, of executives came from China. And I detected that my audience, those MBA students, undergraduate students, executives, they were very eager to try to understand what may happen in the future to consumer markets and to financial markets. And the reason, of course, is that they felt that they were going through a very big transformation. So that was 7 years ago. About 3 years ago or so, after making many of these presentations about the topic, I decided to write a book. And the book, the product of that is what you can see today. And the point of the book is that there are essentially three kinds of trends taking place that will reshape the business landscape. So the first set of trends have to do with population changes. The second set of trends has to do with the rise of emerging markets, with, of course, China very prominent among them. And then the third type of trend has to do with technology and technological change. So in the book, I essentially analyze in depth those three trends and what kind of a world in consumer and financial markets they're going to be creating between now and the year 2030. And I will justify in a moment why I use the year 2030. During this presentation, I'm also going to tell you about how this pandemic affects the trends that I mentioned in the book. And as I'm sure you realize, this pandemic is different from other crises that we've had in the past, in the sense that it accelerates pre-existing trends. This pandemic is a great accelerator. It intensifies what was already going on in the world, those changes in population, the rise of emerging markets, and also changes in technology. And so I was joking while we were waiting for the hour to come for the beginning of this session, I was joking with Professor Chen that my only regret is that the book, instead of having the title 2030, perhaps should have the title 2028, because the future is arriving faster now as a result of the pandemic. Once again, because the pandemic is a great accelerator. So let me just tell you a little bit about the book. So I use the following methodology for trying to understand the future of consumer and financial markets. It has two steps. In the first step, what I do is I follow the babies. I try to understand population trends. And following the babies is really important, understanding how many of them are being born in different parts of the world. Because those babies that are born today, they're going to be the consumers in the future and also the workers. That's the first step in my methodology for forecasting the future. And my second step is to follow the money. That is to say, I also make projections as to how much money those babies are going to have in their pockets. So in the book, I begin precisely with that analysis, following the babies, and I'm going to show you an example in a moment. I try to understand population trends because we're going through a lot of change. And as you know, there are two really important things going on when it comes to population in the world. The first is that fertility is declining. Fertility is the number of babies born to each woman. And the second big change is that populations are aging. We are living longer and longer, but at the same time we have fewer babies. So therefore, as a result, we have more than in the past people above the age of 60. So much so, just to give you one example as to how this affects markets, that by the year 2030, the population above the age of 60 in Japan, in China, in Europe, here in the United States, and in many other countries in the world, will become the largest consumer segment, not just in terms of the number of people, but also in terms of the purchasing power. And that's really important because, at least in my experience, I've done a lot of research on companies that produce and sell consumer goods. They're not very used to thinking about the population above age 60 as being part of their core customer base. So I believe that between now and the year 2030, many companies around the world will have to adjust to that. Now, that's the subject, really, of the second chapter in the book. Gray is the new black. Gray as in the color of the hair when you turn older. And in other words, that gray is going to be the dominant, the most important segment of the market. Now, the third chapter is about the middle class. It's about, particularly the Chinese and the Indian middle classes. Up until now, the European and American middle classes were the largest in the world. But by the year 2030, Asia will be or will have a much bigger middle class than Europe and the United States combined in terms of the purchasing power. So in other words, the largest consumer markets in the world are going to be in Asia and not in Europe and in the United States. In the fourth chapter, I dig deeper into yet another population trend, which is also tied to an economic trend, which is the rise of women as consumers, as savers, and as investors, knowing that every year that passes, there's more and more women who are seeing their incomes increase and also their wealth. So much so that my forecast for the year 2030 is that for the first time in history, women will own more wealth or more net worth, if you want to put it that way, than men. And that is going to bring very important changes to consumer and financial markets because, as you know, women and men are different when it comes to making decisions about their money. The next chapter, chapter number 5 in the book, I talk about cities, because the other big issue that is going on in the world right now, the other big trend, is that cities are growing, especially in South Asia. So that would be India, for example, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, you may be thinking, well, the pandemic perhaps will reverse that trend, especially in Europe and the United States. And I think that may be true, but I don't think that's going to happen, however, in India or Sub-Saharan Africa, because cities are still a major attraction, a major magnet for people living in the countryside because there are more opportunities for them. So after the first 5 chapters, then the rest of the book is all about technology trends. Some of them you know very well. For example, the rise of smartphones and artificial intelligence. That's chapter 6. Chapter 7 is about the sharing economy. So there, with the title, Imagine No Possessions, I'm essentially using one of the verses from the famous song by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So imagine no possessions. Imagine if people only share assets as opposed to own them, including homes, automobiles, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, chapter 8 is about digital tokens in general, and in particular, cryptocurrencies. So I am describing a situation by the year 2030 in which we could have more currencies than countries. And just as an example, as you very well know, China itself, by the year 2030, perhaps even by next year, is likely to have both a physical currency and a cryptocurrency. So that would be 2 currencies in one country. So that's what the book is about. And let me just begin by telling you a little bit about some of those demographic trends in the time that I have remaining here, 15 minutes, and show you how they're going to fundamentally reshape consumer markets and also financial markets around the world. So this is the first topic that I told you about, that fertility, meaning the number of children per woman, is declining everywhere in the world. It's declining, as you can see here, in the less developed markets, like Sub-Saharan Africa. It's declining in the less developed markets, such as the emerging markets of Asia, including China. And it is also, or at least was in the past, declining in the most developed markets, Europe, the United States, Japan. Here, as you can see, the first half of the chart from 1950 to 2019 is actual data, and the rest are projections into the future to the year 2030. But I want to bring you to your attention something that is really important here, that although fertility is declining, for example, in Africa, they are today at a level that is 4 children or more per woman on average. Whereas in other parts of the world, we are either below replacement, which would be 2 children, or just above replacement, okay? And then the second thing that I want to bring to your attention, something that will change the United States and will also change parts of Europe, is that, as you can see here, for the developed countries, this indicator of the fertility rate has actually been increasing very, very slowly since the year 2000. So for the last 20 years, it has been increasing, and the projection is that it will continue to increase into the future. And you may be wondering, why is that? Well, it has to do with immigration. As you know, Europe and the United States have been major destinations for immigrants. And in general, immigrants tend to have more children. So remember these 2 facts here about this chart, because in a moment, you're going to see that they're going to have major implications for consumer markets and for financial markets. Now, you may be wondering, how is COVID-19 going to be changing these patterns in fertility decline that I've just told you about? Well, COVID-19, the pandemic, is going to accelerate the decline in fertility. Why do I say that? For 2 reasons. The first is that recessions, economic problems, and of course a pandemic like this has generated many economic problems, tends to create uncertainty, and also a lot of people lose their jobs. And therefore then, when people are facing uncertainty, or they lose their jobs, or believe that they might lose their jobs, they postpone making important decisions, such as, for example, having babies. So younger people today, younger couples, are postponing having babies. And that by itself contributes to an acceleration of the decline in fertility. Now, the second reason why we're going to see an accelerated decline in fertility has to do with less immigration around the world. As you know, Europe and the United States have turned more protectionist, not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of immigration. So if fewer immigrants arrive into Europe or the United States today, then one should expect that there's going to be even fewer babies in the future. Because remember, immigrant families tend to have more kids, more children than the local families. So that's one side of what I wanted to tell you about, the fertility rate. But the other one is that we're living longer and longer and longer, as I told you earlier. And you can see this for the most developed markets in the world, like Europe and the United States, also for the emerging markets here, and lastly, for the least developed parts of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa. So the combination of all of these trends then results in the situation that you see on this chart. This chart that I'm showing you now is actually in the book, and is, from my perspective, the single most important chart that you can look at these days, because what you see on this chart is going to change every market in the world. Let me explain what you're seeing on the screen. The chart begins in 1950 and goes all the way to the year 2019 with actual data. And then after that are forecasts into the future. Vertically, we're measuring what percentage of the world total population is in different countries or regions in the world. As you can see, there are some really big changes that are going on. One is, of course, the rise of Africa, right? Remember, Africa has more babies, about 4 per woman, than any other part of the world. And on top of that, life expectancy is growing very quickly in Africa because of better public health, economic growth, and better nutrition. Now, we're also going to see that in the next few years, that the percentage represented by South Central Asia, which includes India, is going to level off, is going to reach a maximum, okay? We also know that in Europe, there's going to be a big decline in the number of people relative to the rest of the world. That's once again because they're having fewer babies than anybody else. That is also going on in China, as you can see over here. And if you add South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, other East Asian countries, then you also get a decline for all of East Asia. So let me just tell you, why the year 2030? Well, look, by the year 2030, according to this chart, Africa will become the second biggest region in the world by population. That's a big change. That's going to be a very different world. Also, by the year 2030, the growth of South and Central Asia, which includes India, will level off, will reach a maximum. And also in the year 2030, Europe will be the 5th largest region in the world. But look, in the year 1950, it was the 2nd biggest region. Also a very big change. Now, what is the effect of COVID-19? That's what you see with the arrows here. I think that the leveling off in South Central Asia will arrive earlier. I think that the growth of Africa will also arrive earlier. And I think that the decline of Europe, because of the big impact that the pandemic is having over there, the decline will also get accelerated. As a result of that, those curves will cross each other, not in the year 2030, but most likely, perhaps in the year 2028. So once again, as I told you at the beginning, the future is arriving much earlier than we thought. And so my message to you is that everybody, companies, consumers, workers, savers, investors, we all need to get prepared for that new world that is emerging right around the corner. Now, let me point out a couple more implications of this analysis here for consumer markets in particular. So not only we will see a redistribution of the centers of gravity of population around the world, as a result of these trends between now and the year 2030. But we're also going to see very important changes in the age distribution of the population. Let's focus first on the age group between 15 and 35 years old, okay? So if you take a look at the largest countries in the world in the year 2020, and what's going to happen to the number of people between those two ages by the year 2030, you can see that there are three different types of countries. First, we have a country like India, which is going to have even more young people by the year 2030. They're going to go from 478 million to 485 million people between the ages of 15 and 35. Now, the second type of country is your own, China, where there's going to be a decline. You're going to go from having 396 million people between the ages of 15 and 35 today, down to 337 million people by the year 2030. Now, don't get me wrong. These 337 million people in China, they're going to be much richer than the young people in China today, because incomes, of course, are increasing very quickly in China. So this is going to be, by far, the largest young market in the world by purchasing power. That's going to be in China by the year 2030. And then the third type of country is a country such as the United States. In the United States, as you can see, the number will not really change. It will be 89 million when today is about 90 million. So almost no change. But remember what I told you a few minutes ago about immigration. So most of these young people, 89.5 million people in the year 2030 in the United States between the ages of 15 and 35, they are going to be what we here call minorities, meaning African Americans, Asian Americans, or Hispanics. And you know what? They're very different as consumers because they tend to save more money than white Americans. Also, because they marry earlier in life. And lastly, believe it or not, they're more likely to be using digital platforms than the white Americans. So from the point of view of consumption, these changes here that you see in not only the size, but also the composition of the younger age group between 15 and 35 is going to be really, really important between now and the year 2030. Now let's examine very quickly the other end of the age distribution, the population above the age of 60. Well, here there's only one type of country. Every country in the world, China, India, the US, Japan, Russia, Brazil, everybody is going to have more people above the age of 60. In China, you're going to go from 249, almost 250 million people today, to 363 million by the year 2030. So globally, not only in China, everywhere in the world, this segment is going to become the biggest consumer segment by purchasing power by the year 2030. Companies will need to stop paying so much attention to the young consumer and start thinking more seriously about the old consumer, knowing that if somebody reaches the age of 60 these days, that person on average is expected to live another 20 or 25 years. That's another lifetime. And by the way, most of the wealth in the world, of the net worth, is owned by people above the age of 60. In most countries in the world, including China, people above the age of 60 own between 60 and 70% of all the wealth. By the way, that wealth needs to be invested because people in that age group want their savings to last for as long as they live. Here in the United States, the percentage of the wealth owned by people above the age of 60 is 80%. It makes a big difference. So that's why I always say that companies will need to change over the next few years. And by the way, financial institutions, including banks, they also will need to change. They need to offer different kinds of products and services to this age demographic. So Professor Chen, in the last 5 or 6 minutes of my presentation, before we start taking questions from the audience, I would like to tell you about the other big issue that is going on in the world right now, that where China is playing a very important role. And it is the second step in my methodology, which, if you remember, the first step was following the babies. The second step is following the money, right? And as you very well know, what's going on with emerging markets is extremely important. Here, what you see is forecasts of gross domestic product growth, GDP growth, for the years 2020 and 2021. You also have the actual number of GDP change for the year 2019. As you can see, the mature economies of Japan, Europe, the United States, they're going to suffer a big decline in GDP during 2020 due to the pandemic. And hopefully they will recover in the year 2021, okay? But look at China. In China, the projection is that your economy is not going to shrink because of the pandemic. It will grow at a slower rate than in the past, but it will grow compared to the big decline that we're going to see in the mature economies. And the Chinese economy is going to be growing very vigorously, according to this projection, in the year 2021. That is very different from India. That is very different from Latin America and other emerging markets. So really, what's going to happen here is that China is going to become the most dynamic emerging market in the years to come. So much so that it's very clear that by the year 2030, China will be the biggest consumer market. Here what we're measuring is the purchasing power of the middle class, which essentially is the consumer market in each country. China will be the biggest, bigger than the European Union, the United States, and of course, India, right? Very important change. And when you add up all of the Asian countries in the year 2030, you see that it's more than half. So I tell my students at Wharton that this is going to have enormous implications for companies. Because you see, for the last 100 years, companies around the world have always had the American consumer in mind. They've always looked at the American market for the latest trends. They've always tested their products or their services with the American consumer. The American consumer was the single most important part of the global economy. Over the next 10 years, that's going to change. The Chinese consumer, and more broadly, the Asian consumer, is going to become the most important in the world. And companies are going to start making decisions based on that fact. Really, really important change. And let me end my comments by going back to what I told you about women at the beginning. Remember, I told you that women are likely to be owning more than half of the world's wealth and or net worth between now and the year 2030. And that's, of course, because of two reasons. The first is that women are studying very hard. They're getting a university degree. They're pursuing a career. And year after year, they're doing better from an economic point of view, especially in terms of income. Now, that income, higher income for women, enables them to save money and hopefully to get good returns on it, so they accumulate wealth. And the second factor, of course, as you know, extremely important, is that women tend to live longer than men on average. Here in the United States, it's about 5.5 years longer than men. In China, it's also a similar number. So of course, women then have more years to accumulate wealth, and also they're more likely to inherit from their husband than the other way around. Now, the rights of women as consumers, as savers, and as investors, it's going to have major implications for the economies of China, the United States, Europe, Japan, everywhere in the world. Let me just in closing point out some of them. And of course, if you want to read more about this, you can go to the book. So first, in terms of consumption, look, women tend to be more willing to spend more money on education, healthcare, and insurance. They prefer more comprehensive insurance. Well, those are very important parts of the economy. If women behave different than men in education spending, healthcare spending, and insurance spending, that's going to have a big impact in the economy, because those three sectors here in the United States, for example, account for 30% of gross domestic product. Women are also different in terms of their savings behavior. So single women tend to save more money than men. Married women, when there are no kids, also tend to save more money than men. In general, women tend to prefer security. And therefore, they save more money because they see savings as a way of being more secure in terms of the future. And then lastly, how is this going to change financial markets? Well, let's compare the investment behavior of men and women. In most countries in the world, what we observe is that women are, on average, more risk averse than men. So therefore, when it comes to investing their money, they choose different asset classes. Perhaps they buy more bonds than equities. If they buy equities, perhaps they buy more equities in larger companies rather than smaller companies. How do we know this? Well, it's relatively easy. All you need to do is just examine how people allocate, for example, their pension funds to different asset classes. I can tell you that here in the United States, systematically, women tend to put their money into asset classes that are less risky. So in other words, financial markets will get transformed, because if gradually over the next 10 years, we have more women owning wealth in the world, and at least part of that wealth is invested in securities such as bonds or equities or stock in companies, then essentially what you're going to see is that a greater percentage of investments in the market will be guided by risk aversion as opposed to risk taking. So all of these trends that I've been telling you about, and granted I've been focusing on the demographic ones, will fundamentally transform consumer and financial markets over the next few years. I don't think that any company can afford to ignore these trends. And let me tell you also that it is now, in the year 2020, in the year 2021, that companies need to start adjusting, preparing for that new reality in consumer markets and in financial markets that we're going to see around the world by the year 2030. So I want to leave you with those ideas there. I'd like also to tell you that if you go to my website at Wharton, and we will make this website available later along with the PowerPoints, you can download all sorts of resources, all of them free, okay, no cost to you whatsoever, including studies, information, presentations, and videos about what the future will bring in terms of consumer and financial markets and business more broadly. And you will also be able to find materials as to how the pandemic, COVID-19, is changing the world, mostly, as I said at the beginning, by accelerating all of these population, economic, and technological trends. So Professor Chen, I'm going to stop sharing now. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And I'm eager to listen to some of the questions or comments and to provide some answer to them.
Okay, thank you, Professor Guillen, for a very informative and a very insightful presentation to give us really like the comprehensive landscape for the future, particularly how it's going to happen in the next 10 years. So after that reading your book, and also I share with it with some of my family member and also students, and some of the female ladies, they comment to me that in Professor Guillen's book that mentioned 50% property in the world is going to be owned by the female. And they say that's not enough. we want more. Because my wife tell me like in my family, your property is my property, but my property is still my property. So yeah, but let's just
How that's also, by the way, what my wife always says. So my wife always says, whatever is yours is mine, and whatever is mine is mine. That's what she
right,
says.
right, exactly. So I think we share quite the same similar culture in that sense. So thank you very much. And I think one of the questions from the audience is that you are addressing age trends in your book for 2030s. So as we know that when every time that the world is changing rapidly or transforming so dramatically, let's say 200-300 years ago when the steam engine was invented, that comes with the industry revolution. So what do you think maybe like the few factors that trigger that in the next 10 years changing so dramatically? Is it because technology or is it because population? What kind of factor do you think is the most important?
Yes, that's a great question. And the argument that I make in the book is that all of those trends that I've been telling you about are equally important. But that's not really the point. The point is that if you analyze each of those trends individually, if you only take into consideration one of the trends at a time, then you are missing the revolutionary moment that we're going through. Because the whole point is that those trends relate to one another. They reinforce one another, and they're all pushing us in the same direction, which is towards massive change in the world. And I would agree with the person who asked the question that the changes that we saw in the world 300 years ago, when the Industrial Revolution started to happen in England, driven by a number of things. And let's remember again what those things were, because I see a lot of parallels with the current situation. So one of them was a demographic expansion. And if you remember, increases in productivity in agriculture that enabled to free up a lot of labor. And that labor moved to the cities, and then the labor could be employed in industry, in manufacturing. That was one change. Another one was the one that the person referred to, which is technological innovation. The steam engine and so many other things, the railroad, so many other things that also coincided in time. But the steam engine was absolutely essential, of course. And then the third thing, which I think was also equally revolutionary, was an expansion of consumer markets in the world. At that time, that happened because of the British Empire. In other words, England would produce a lot of things, and those companies, those factories in England knew that they had a market all over the world, right, available to them. And that essentially set into motion a whole process of bigger and bigger factories, more economies of scale, and just, the economy took off, the industrial economy took off. And that's what I see today, right? What I see today is we have these demographic changes. We have these changes in emerging markets, right? So we have new big, pockets of consumers. It's not just Europe and the United States anymore and Japan. You also have China, you have India, you have Indonesia, you have Thailand, you have Turkey, you have Sub-Saharan Africa, right? You have Latin America. And then on top of that, we have, instead of the steam engine, we have digital technologies, essentially changing the rules of the game in every industry, right? Making old business models obsolete. But once again, the reason why right now we're going to have so much change between now and 2030 is not just because of technology. It's not just because of China and India. It's not just because of changes in population. It's because of the combination, the coincidence of all of those changes within the next few years. And look, I think all of us are privileged in the following sense, which is that we're going to see over the next 10 years history in the making, because these transitions, these big transitions, only occur every 200 years or 300 years. right? And my hope, by the way, and I think this is also really important, is that as we go through this transformation, that we minimize the frictions and the tensions, and that we try to maximize the opportunities embedded in them. Because as you know, no big transformation is easy. The transformation that took place 300 years ago with the Industrial Revolution was actually very difficult, right? A lot of people felt excluded. There was a lot of poverty. There were wars, all sorts of things. So hopefully in the next 10 years, we will be able to avoid that. I mean, that is my hope. And I think we should all be working towards that. But again, I think the person who asked the question is absolutely correct in comparing what we're going through now with the Industrial Revolution of 300 years ago.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Guillen. So I think the next question is regarding the paradigm of employment. So if we look back to maybe in the last few decades, maybe people tend to have the so-called lifelong employment, maybe at least in East Asia, that we prefer lifelong employment, which make the life is stable. But if we look like the situation right now, for example, Uber Eats, that Food Panda, a lot of things is even more accelerated in 2030s. Let's say that Uber Eats. So their paradigm of employment is much more not just like the contractor, but it's like that I am the independent owner and I partner with Uber Eats. So how do you see that the trend of the paradigm of employment changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, it doesn't have to be Uber. It can also be Didi, right?
Right.
And all of the other. And Didi, I think, eventually will probably become bigger than Uber. Because quite frankly, my prediction is also that most of these Chinese platform businesses will become bigger than the American ones. They will become the biggest in the world, right? You know, already we were talking earlier about Alibaba, which is headquartered in the same city as your university. And, you know, I think from the point of view of platform businesses, China really, at least for the next few years, will be the pioneer. So let me answer the question with 3 very basic points, because I think the question is extremely good. First, I didn't mention in my presentation, but this is in the book, that for me, the single most important implication of the demographic changes that we're seeing in the world, especially the fact that we're living longer and longer and longer than before, is that I think that the time has come for companies, for governments, and for all of us to abandon a way of thinking about life that originates from the 19th century, a long time ago, which is the idea that life progresses in stages. When you're young, you learn at school. Right. When you're middle-aged, you work. And when you're old, you retire. And I think that that is the first thing that we need to change. And we need to persuade companies, governments, everyone in society that that is no longer possible. Because you see, when people now retire at age 60, on average, they're going to live another 25 years. So they could have another career. Not only that, given that so many things are changing right now, that technology is progressing very quickly, right, we're going to have to go back to school several times during our lives. It's not going to be enough just to go to school when we're young, right? We will need to acquire new skills and new methods and new kinds of knowledge in order to continue living productively. Second point, you mentioned you know, the effect of the platform businesses in terms of essentially making more workers be kind of external contractors. Here in the United States, we call it the gig economy, right? GIG, the gig economy, gig jobs, and so on and so forth. Well, if you think that is a big change, I think you haven't seen anything yet, because it's going to get much, much bigger than that. Why do I say that? Because of the pandemic. Because you see, I think the biggest change that this pandemic is going to have is the trend towards remote work. Remote work is a platform kind of work. But notice that it's a kind of work that is remote. Like, for example, Professor Cheng, now you're saying that you're teaching from Taipei, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that people who are doing remote work are gig workers. They could still be employees of companies. But I think the interesting thing to watch in the next few years is going to be how, as a result of remote work using platforms by employees, companies decide that they can hire people globally, not just from, nearby the company. So for instance, if a Chinese company is looking for a marketing expert, they can go and hire somebody in Singapore. And they can tell that person, you don't have to move to China. You can work for my company as an employee using some kind of a platform, digital platform, from Singapore. So I think, Professor Chen, we're going to see the emergence of a truly global market for talent as a result of this. And that, I think, is going to be revolutionary because we have never seen that. Whenever a company in the past needed to hire an expert on something, that person would need to move somewhere, right? To where the company is or has offices. But that's no longer necessary. You can also have remote work for that person. So I think that is going to be truly revolutionary. Now, the third thing that I would like to mention is the possibility that we see much more automation driven by artificial intelligence and robotics and all of that. As you know, so far, most of the automation has taken place in manufacturing. I think now the pandemic, because of social distancing, because of lockdowns, because of other constraints, has provided companies in the service sector with a lot of incentives to automate. I was on the phone 2 months ago with a woman who is the CEO of a major hotel chain in Asia. And she was telling me that they're trying to automate everything, including room service, so that their guests at the hotel feel comfortable staying at the hotel. So instead of having a human being deliver the room service, they have a robot. Okay. So automation, I think, is yet another trend that is accelerated by the pandemic. And that's also going to change work because obviously it's going to eliminate some jobs. It's going to create other jobs. And in many cases, like for example, our job, as professors, I think machines and artificial intelligence will help us be better professors, right? So I think that's the other possibility here. And with that, I finish my answer, is that we should think about technology in the context of work in the future as not just a substitute for human beings, but also as something that may help employees become more creative and more productive at what they do. So I agree with the person that has asked the question that we're going to see a lot of changes in the world of work as a result of this pandemic and as a result of the trends that I described in the book between now and the year 2030. We're going to see a lot of changes.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Guillen. So I think it is very important to see and also to be well prepared for really like the paradigm of employment is changing. So the next question is from, I think maybe one senior person that he mentioned that now he is in his 63. So after, which means after 2 years, he is in the age of getting retired. So after he read your book that he have some thought that what should he do after he retire? Because obviously that people's life is getting long. Maybe average 80 or 90 years old is nothing that really special in nowadays. So this is the first question. And the second question, because that especially in Japan or China, or maybe in many countries, the pension system or pension mechanism is really that need to support it by the young generation. Right. So how they can get their pension is really supported by the young generation. But it seems to us that addressing in your book that the young generation is getting less and less, particularly in many economies. So what do you think that those two issues?
Okay, so let me also answer the question with 3 points.
Right.
The first is that the person who asked the question, he is very young. He's
Right.
only 63. On average, that means that maybe this person has another 20 or 25 years to live if he is the average person, right? So again, I think we need to abandon that way of thinking. You see, a 65-year-old today is a very different kind of person from a 65-year-old, let's say in 1980. Very different.
Right.
Because a 65-year-old today is in much better mental and physical shape than a person of the same age 40 years ago.
Right.
And it has a longer life expectancy ahead of him or her.
Right.
So, second point, yes, we're going to have trouble in many parts of the world paying pensions to so many people above the age of 65. Because remember, we have fewer and fewer people who are younger. So there's only really, 3 solutions I see to that. One is that you bring in more young immigrants, okay?
Right.
But as I said earlier, this is difficult because now, as you know, a lot of people in the world are against immigration. Things have changed. Right. The second possible solution is that the government cuts the benefits, the pension benefits. But that's not good, right? Okay. Right. And the third reason, which is the one that I propose in the book, is that we abandon this idea that you learn when you're young, you work when you're middle-aged, and you retire when you are above the age of 65. We need to change that. I think the economy, I think companies, and I think people themselves will benefit if they continue working at least part-time. But you see, here's the good news, Professor Chen. The good news, that's my last point, is that technology, remote work, gig work, all of these things are perfect for people who are 65 or 70 or 75. They can retire from their usual job, and then they can use their knowledge and their experience to work part-time, remotely, as part of the gig economy, using a digital platform so that they have more flexibility. And I think that is the future. That is the future. It's a future in which people above the age of 60 are not just in retirement. They're also learning. Maybe they're taking a class from you at your university. Right. They're also working. Because again, I think it's very difficult to be in retirement without doing anything for 25 years on average. Right. You see, when retirement was invented in Germany, right, in 1875 or 1880, a long time ago, it was the Germans who invented this. The average life expectancy was 45 years. Very few people made it to retirement, to age 65. But that was 140 years ago. Things have improved now. Nutrition, incomes, healthcare, everything. And now, instead of living on average 45 years, we live 85. So we need to change our mindset about that. That's what I think really important. And again, by the year 2030, people like the person who asked the question, who are above the age of 60, will be the biggest segment in the market. Things are going to be completely different.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for Professor Guillen. And I think during your presentation, maybe one trend that the reader is particularly very interested is in terms of sharing economy. As we know that Airbnb and also some sharing economy platform is getting popular. So what do you think that means to the society or the world in the next 10 years? And what kind of thing that people should prepare or maybe should take advantage of the sharing economy?
Yeah, let me make 2 quick comments about that. So the first is that the sharing economy essentially means that people are maybe less interested in owning assets, such as homes or cars or what have you. and they would prefer to share them. And this is particularly true among young people. So obviously, it's still too early to tell whether they will change as they grow older, because that's always a possibility. Now, the second point that I want to make, I think it's going to be really, really important for us to develop the sharing economy for the following reason. Now we don't only have middle-class consumers in Europe and the United States buying all of those things. We also have Chinese middle-class consumers. We have Indian middle-class consumers, and so on and so forth. So we don't have enough natural resources in the world. So I think that sharing would be very important. And by the way, if we want to address climate change, which I think is a very important threat in the world, I think it's very important to do what the Chinese government is doing, which is to promote new energy sources. I mean, China is the country in the world that invests the most in solar energy and wind energy, right? More so than any other country in the world. But I think that in addition to whatever governments do, I think we also need, as consumers, to become more mindful about how much we consume. And I think the sharing economy has the potential of helping us be consumers and enjoy life, but at the same time preserve the natural resources of the world, right, for the future. So that's why I think the sharing economy, and I provide many examples of this in the book, is so pivotal, so central to our future. So a technology-mediated sharing economy with all of these platforms, I think, is going to be really, really important in terms of meeting the challenges of natural resources and the environment and climate change in the future.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Guillen. And I think one of very exciting the issue that you're addressing in your book is in terms of cryptocurrency. Nowadays, I think in 2020, a lot of the central bank also discussing about CBDC, central bank digital currency. And in the last 2 years, we also saw that Facebook contribute a lot of effort to launch the Libra project. But in the very beginning, it's very exciting and a lot of the stakeholders get involved. But finally, it seems when it comes to in 2020, it seems not as much as they claim. So what do you think that the digital currency will change our life? Because that some people also criticize, but in terms of the digital currency, which means that government have more understanding of that the single dollar you spend for which purpose. So what do you think about that?
Well, look, so I explain all of this in the book in the last chapter number 9. Governments and central banks, they don't want to lose control over money, because obviously that would make it harder to implement monetary policy, for example. And you mentioned the Libra cryptocurrency, which was launched a little bit more than a year ago by Facebook, along with other companies. And if you remember, within a few hours of the announcement, central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, said that they had a lot of doubts about it, right? And that's what I think killed Facebook. The same way that the growth of Bitcoin has also been limited by the regulations of central banks around the world. So in the book, I propose the following thing. I don't think that cryptocurrencies will succeed as a substitute for money in the world, because governments are always going to be suspicious. And as a last resort, they will issue their own digital currencies, governments, right? So I'm talking here about decentralized currencies like Bitcoin, or about currencies issued by companies such as, or coalitions of companies such as Libra. So what do I think is going to happen? What I think is going to happen is that entrepreneurs, innovators are going to say, well, let's not think about cryptocurrencies. Let's think about digital tokens. So a digital token can include a cryptocurrency, but it should also include many, many other things, so that then it is not just a substitute for money, but rather it is a new way of conducting transactions in the economy. Let me give you an example. we could have a digital token that, in addition to being a cryptocurrency, is also incorporates a set of discount coupons, like what Groupon does. I'm not sure whether you know this company in the US, Groupon, right? Which gives you discount coupons.
Right.
And in addition to that, it could be a digital token that provides you with incentives, for example, to save water or to save energy. Okay. It could also be a digital token that enables you, for example, to renew your passport. Okay. Or that enables you, even better, to travel around the world without having to have a passport. So I think the important thing here is that cryptocurrencies have to be so much more than just money. They have to be a digital token that incorporates many different kinds of possibilities, right? For conducting transactions in the economy by consumers, by companies, etc., using digital technology. That, I think, is the future. And I have no doubt that there will be some company, some entrepreneur, some innovator that will bring this to life in the next 10 years. I have no doubt. That's my projection.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Professor Guillen. May we add one last question?
Yes, let's take one more. I'm enjoying this. This is great.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this question is from one of the SME owners based in Zhejiang province, which is our university is located. So that his question is mentioning that in the last 3-4 decades, we see that the globalization is accelerated because of transportation, because of the technology. But in the last maybe 2-3 years or coming to 2020, it seems the phenomenon of deglobalization is happening. For example, that the trade agreement, or maybe like the immigration issue, or maybe for the nationalism is getting popular. So for the business, for the small and medium business, do you have any survival tips for that in the next 10 years?
So here's my answer to the question. I think you need to understand which aspects of globalization are being reversed and which aspects of globalization are not being reversed. Because yes, there's more protectionism. And by the way, a lot of that has been caused by the United States over the last 2 or 3 years, all of these trade wars. And let me tell you, as you know, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, was a student at the Wharton School. But that was before I became a professor at the Wharton School. I can assure you that if President Trump had taken a class from me, he would have been a much better president, okay? But here's the point. The point is that, yes, there are more restrictions now to trading goods. But you know, trading services is becoming even more important than trading goods. Not only that, exchanges of information in the world. That's really what matters now. And those are still growing, okay? And there's a lot of businesses that you can build around that. And let me show you another example that I referred to earlier, remote work. If we see the creation or the formation of a global market for talent, that is also more globalization. So yes, in some ways, some of the old ways in which the world used to be global, for example, immigration or trade in physical goods, there's some challenges there. I think those challenges are temporary, but it is absolutely true that over the last 3 years, as this small business owner has pointed out, we have seen de-globalization, kind of a reversal of globalization. But I think in so many other ways, especially services, the exchange of information, and also the potential for a global market for talent, what we're seeing is more globalization. So I have, I would make this recommendation to small business owners, which is try to look for ways in which you can connect your business to those aspects of globalization that are growing, right? Because I think the opportunities are tremendous. And even if we continue to have some protectionism in the world, I don't think it's going to reverse all of globalization. Maybe it will cause a temporary reversal in trading goods, for instance. But even that, I think, may change also for the better in the near future. So we shall see. But I do believe that we're still seeing globalization or globalizing trends, and that most of those trends present opportunities for businesses, both small and large.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Guillen, for bringing us that the insight and the very interesting presentation. We really enjoy the conversation with you and also learn a lot of new trends from you. So really appreciate for your valuable time today.
No, thank you so much, Professor Chen, once again for inviting me. And again, I encourage everyone to follow me on Twitter, befriend me on LinkedIn. Please send me an invitation. And also you can come to my website, and there's a lot of free, no-cost materials that you can download, videos and all sorts of analysis.
Right. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you maybe either in Wharton or maybe in Hangzhou in the near future, or maybe online once again.
I would very much like to travel to Hangzhou, and then, I will only do it if you promise me that you will treat me to a nice Chinese dinner there.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you very much today, and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much.
Everyone for attending.